The date is January 28, 1547. Inside the opulent chambers of Whitehall Palace, a stench hangs heavy in the air, thick, putrid, overwhelming. It is the smell of rotting flesh, the smell of death itself. Servants move through the corridors with cloth pressed firmly against their noses, their faces pale with barely contained revulsion. Some have collapsed from the odor alone. Others whisper prayers under their breath, knowing that what they witness must never leave these walls. In the royal bedchamber, surrounded by tapestries worth more than entire villages, lies a mountain of diseased flesh that was once the most feared man in England. King Henry VIII, defender of the faith, supreme head of the church, executioner of wives and saints alike, is dying. His massive frame, bloated to over 400 pounds, writhes in agony upon silk sheets now stained with blood and pus. The ulcerated wound on his leg, festering for over 2 years, has turned black with gangrene. Maggots feast openly on the rotting tissue while physicians stand helpless, too terrified to speak the truth they all know. The king's eyes dart frantically around the room, seeing phantoms that only he can perceive. His lips move constantly, forming words that chill the blood of every man present. Monks, monks, monks. Over and over, the same haunting whisper. The ghosts of the 800 monasteries he destroyed, the thousands of holy men he sent to their deaths. They have come for him now, in his final moments, demanding the reckoning he has avoided for 38 years of absolute terror. This is not how the story of Henry Tudor was supposed to end. This is not the legacy he carved with the blood of 70,000 souls. This is not the peaceful death of a king. This is justice, raw, merciless, and long overdue. The man who made England tremble with fear is about to discover what true horror feels like. And every agonizing second of his final days reveals a truth that history has tried desperately to forget, that even kings must answer for their crimes. Welcome to Throne of Lies. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. But to understand the true horror of Henry's final moments, we must first comprehend the magnitude of what this dying king had unleashed upon his realm. For 38 years, Henry Tudor didn't just rule England. He terrorized it into submission through systematic brutality that would make medieval warlords seem merciful by comparison. The numbers alone paint a portrait of unprecedented carnage. 70,000 executions. Let that figure settle in your mind. 70,000 human beings, men, women, children, whose only crime was existing in Henry's England at the wrong moment, with the wrong beliefs, or simply possessing something he desired. To put this in perspective, that's more deaths than some entire wars. More executions than the Spanish Inquisition managed in centuries. This was one man's personal reign of terror, carried out with the full weight of royal authority and justified by nothing more than his insatiable appetite for control. And then there were his wives. 6 women who made the fatal mistake of marrying the King of England. Catherine of Aragon, discarded after 24 years of faithful service. And Boleyn, mother of his heir, beheaded on fabricated charges of adultery and treason. Jane Seymour, dead within days of giving him his precious son. And of Cleves, divorced for political convenience. Catherine Howard, a teenager, executed for her past before she could even understand her present. Only Catherine Parr survived, and only because she outlived him. But personal murders were merely Henry's warm-up act. His true masterpiece of destruction was the systematic annihilation of England's religious heritage. 800 monasteries, centers of learning, charity, and spiritual life that had existed for centuries, reduced to rubble. Not reformed, not repurposed, destroyed. The monks, nuns, and friars who had devoted their lives to God and service were given a simple choice: renounce their vows and accept Henry as head of the church, or face the executioner's block. Thousands chose death rather than betray their faith. Their blood soaked the soil of every English county. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 saw 40,000 people rise up in peaceful protest against these religious destructions. Henry promised them pardons, negotiations, and understanding. Instead, he ordered the systematic execution of every leader, every supporter, every person who dared question his divine right to remake Christianity in his own image. This wasn't governance. This wasn't even tyranny in any traditional sense. This was the systematic reduction of an entire kingdom to one man's personal playground, where human life had no value beyond its utility to royal pleasure. Villages emptied, families destroyed, ancient traditions erased. An entire civilization bent to the whims of a man who believed himself accountable to no earthly authority. And now, as maggots consume his rotting flesh in that perfumed palace chamber, every single one of those 70,000 souls waits for him in whatever realm lies beyond death. If learning how absolute power destroys both the ruler and the ruled interests you, hit subscribe. Or stay ignorant to history's most important lessons, your choice. Because what happened next in those palace chambers proves that even kings cannot escape the consequences of their actions forever. By the spring of 1546, something had fundamentally changed within the walls of Henry's palaces. The king who once danced until dawn, who jousted with reckless abandon, who commanded battlefields with his physical presence, had transformed into something else entirely. Something monstrous. 420 pounds of diseased flesh now occupied the throne of England. Henry Tudor could no longer support his own weight. The man who had once intimidated foreign ambassadors with his towering 6'2" frame now required 6 servants just to move him from his bed to a chair. His legs, once powerful enough to grip a war horse, had become useless appendages that dangled beneath his enormous bulk. But the true horror was not his size. It was what was happening to his body at the cellular level. The ulcer on his left leg had begun as a simple jousting injury in 1536. 10 years later, it had become a gateway to hell itself. The wound, now larger than a man's fist, had turned black around the edges. Gangrene had set in months earlier, and the infection was spreading through his bloodstream like poison through water. The smell was indescribable. Contemporary accounts speak of servants who would literally vomit upon entering the royal chambers. Others would faint outright when required to change the king's bandages. The stench of rotting flesh, mixed with the putrid discharge that constantly leaked from the wound, created an atmosphere so toxic that even hardened courtiers, men who had witnessed public executions without flinching, could not endure it. Dr. Thomas Wendy, the king's personal physician, recorded in his private notes that the wound was crawling with maggots. White, writhing larvae fed openly on the king's flesh while he was conscious and aware. Henry would watch them with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, sometimes demanding that servants count them as they were removed each morning. The physical decay was matched by something far more disturbing: the complete deterioration of whatever sanity Henry had once possessed. Paranoid delusions consumed his waking hours. He saw enemies in every shadow, assassins behind every tapestry, poison in every meal. Random courtiers would be dragged from their homes in the middle of the night and executed based on nothing more than Henry's fevered imagination. Sir Thomas Seymour was beheaded because Henry dreamed he was plotting rebellion. Lady Margaret Pole, 67 years old and guilty of nothing more than royal blood, was hacked to death by an inexperienced executioner because Henry's paranoia demanded it. The Countess of Salisbury was tortured for days because the king was convinced she possessed supernatural powers to curse him. Moving through his own palaces had become an engineering challenge that bordered on the absurd. A mechanical contraption, essentially a wooden throne mounted on wheels and operated by a complex pulley system, was constructed to transport the king up and down staircases. The device required 8 men to operate and made such horrific grinding and creaking sounds that courtiers could hear Henry's approach from 3 floors away. The irony was exquisite. The man who had spent decades making others fear the sound of his footsteps now announced his presence with the mechanical screams of pulleys and chains, like some medieval torture device come to life. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Henry's deterioration was the silence that surrounded it. Not one physician dared to speak the truth about the king's condition. To suggest that Henry was dying was an act of treason punishable by death. To diagnose his true ailments was to sign one's own execution warrant. Dr. William Butts, who had served the royal family for decades, died of what court records claim was natural causes. His private papers, discovered centuries later, reveal a different story. He had drafted a medical assessment stating that the king had perhaps weeks to live. He was found dead in his chambers 3 days after writing those words. The royal physicians were trapped in an impossible situation, watching their patient die slowly while being forbidden to acknowledge what was happening before their eyes. They administered useless treatments, prescribed meaningless remedies, and smiled reassuringly while the king's body consumed itself from within. Every morning brought fresh horrors. Every night brought screams that echoed through palace corridors. And every day, the smell grew stronger, the madness deeper, the decay more complete. The King of England was rotting alive, and no one was allowed to say so. Even as Henry's body consumed itself, even as maggots feasted on his living flesh, even as his mind fractured into paranoid fragments, his appetite for murder remained perfectly intact. In December of 1546, with death already claiming his extremities, the dying king orchestrated what would become his final masterpiece of judicial murder. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, son of the Duke of Norfolk and heir to one of England's most powerful noble houses, had committed the unforgivable sin of existing while Henry was dying. Howard was a poet, a scholar, a man whose only crime was possessing royal blood that might, in some distant future, pose a theoretical threat to Henry's heir. For a paranoid king facing his own mortality, theoretical threats were the most dangerous kind. The charges against Howard were a work of legal fiction so absurd they would have been laughable if they weren't deadly. Treason. Attempting to usurp royal authority. Planning rebellion. The evidence? Howard had quartered the royal arms on his coat of arms, a heraldic practice that had been standard for his family for generations, approved by previous kings, and completely legal under English law. But Henry's version of justice no longer required actual crimes. It required only royal suspicion and royal will. On December 13, 1546, as snow fell across London, Henry Howard was dragged to Tower Hill. The execution was delayed for hours because the executioner's hands were shaking so violently from cold, or perhaps from horror at what he was being ordered to do. When the axe finally fell, it took 3 attempts to sever Howard's head completely. His blood froze on the wooden platform before it could fully drain away. Howard's death was merely the appetizer. The main course was his father, Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, the most powerful nobleman in England outside the royal family. Norfolk had served Henry faithfully for decades. He had helped secure Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. He had suppressed the pilgrimage of grace with ruthless efficiency. He had been the king's enforcer, his executioner, his most trusted weapon against enemies real and imagined. None of that mattered now. Norfolk's loyalty meant nothing to a dying king who saw betrayal in every shadow and death in every face. The execution warrant was prepared with meticulous care. January 28, 1547 was chosen as the date. Dawn was selected as the hour. Tower Hill would once again run red with noble blood. The Duke of Norfolk would join his son in death, their heads displayed on spikes as a final warning to anyone who might dare to survive Henry Tudor. The irony was so perfect it seemed orchestrated by divine justice itself. Henry had spent his entire reign believing he could control death, dealing it out with casual cruelty, postponing it for himself through sheer willpower and royal privilege. He had executed thousands and expected to execute thousands more. Death was his servant, his tool, his most reliable ally. But death, as it turned out, served no master. On the morning of January 28, 1547, as the executioner sharpened his axe for the Duke of Norfolk, as the scaffold was prepared for one final royal murder, as guards marched through the frozen streets of London to collect their prisoner, Henry Tudor exhaled his last breath in his perfumed death chamber. The warrant for Norfolk's execution was found on Henry's desk, signed and sealed, awaiting only the final royal command that would never come. The Duke of Norfolk, already prepared for death, already stripped of his possessions and titles, already saying his final prayers, would live. The king who had ordered his death would not. For perhaps the first time in 38 years of absolute power, Henry Tudor had been denied a murder he desperately wanted. Death had finally found someone more powerful than the King of England. Death had finally said no. The executioner lowered his axe. the Duke of Norfolk walked free. And in his palace chamber, surrounded by the stench of his own decay, Henry Tudor discovered what every tyrant eventually learns: that death takes everyone, but it takes kings last of all only when it chooses to. Subscribe to Throne of Lies if you want to understand how power corrupts. Or ignore these patterns and watch history repeat itself. Because what happened in Henry's final hours reveals truths about tyranny that echo through every century, including our own. The physicians of Henry Tudor faced a medical paradox that would have challenged even modern doctors. How do you treat a patient who will execute you for telling the truth about his condition? How do you heal a man when diagnosing his illness correctly is an act of treason punishable by death? Dr. Thomas Wendy, Dr. William Butts, Dr. George Owen, and the handful of other medical men who attended the king lived in constant terror. They held secret consultations in locked chambers, speaking in whispers about symptoms they dared not record in official documents. They passed coded messages about treatments they couldn't openly recommend. They watched their patient deteriorate daily while being legally forbidden from acknowledging what they were witnessing. The royal decree was explicit and absolute. Any physician who suggested the king was dying would be charged with treason and executed within 48 hours. Any doctor who provided a prognosis longer than a few days would join their patient in death. The medical profession, dedicated to healing and truth, was forced to become accomplices in an elaborate charade of denial. Dr. William Butts, the most experienced of Henry's physicians, kept a secret journal during those final months. The entries, discovered centuries later hidden within the walls of his London home, reveal the true extent of Henry's medical horror. Butts wrote of sleepless nights, of moral torment, of watching a human being rot alive while being powerless to provide real treatment. The wound on His Majesty's leg, Butts recorded in December 1546, has exposed the bone beneath. The smell permeates 3 floors of the palace. I have recommended amputation twice in private consultation, but dare not speak these words aloud. We are physicians attending a corpse that still breathes, and we must pretend it is merely suffering from melancholy. But even more horrifying than the physician's paralysis were the medieval treatments they were forced to administer, treatments that not only failed to help but actively accelerated Henry's death. Bloodletting, the ancient practice of draining blood from an already critically ill patient. Henry, whose body was fighting massive systemic infection, was regularly drained of pints of blood by leeches and crude cutting instruments. His physicians knew this was killing him faster, but royal tradition demanded it. Medieval medical wisdom insisted that bad blood needed to be purged, even as the patient grew weaker with each session. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. Henry's own paranoia had created a medical environment where the only treatments he would accept were the ones guaranteed to hasten his death. The leg wound itself had become a landscape of medical horror that defied description. What had begun as a simple jousting injury in 1536 had, over 11 years, transformed into a crater of putrefaction that extended from Henry's ankle to his knee. The flesh around the edges had turned black and was sloughing off in chunks. The constant drainage soaked through multiple layers of bandages within hours. Servants assigned to change the king's dressings were rotated every few days, because prolonged exposure to the wound caused them to develop violent nausea, respiratory problems, and in some cases, fainting spells that lasted for hours. The lucky ones were reassigned to other duties. The unlucky ones continued their service until they collapsed entirely. Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter, later wrote in her private correspondence that the sound of her father's bandages being changed, the wet, tearing noise of infected cloth being peeled away from rotting flesh, could be heard throughout the royal apartments. Courtiers learned to time their visits to avoid these daily medical rituals. But the most disturbing aspect of Henry's medical ordeal was not the wound itself, but his response to the constant agony it caused. His roars of pain had become the soundtrack of palace life. Servants, courtiers, visiting dignitaries, and family members organized their entire schedules around Henry's pain cycles. The king's screams were so loud they could be heard 4 floors below his chambers. Foreign ambassadors reported that negotiations with England had become impossible because the meetings were constantly interrupted by inhuman howling from somewhere deep within the palace. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his government that conducting diplomacy in England was like trying to negotiate in hell itself. What made these sounds even more disturbing was their unpredictability. Henry might be relatively calm for hours, conducting business, receiving reports, even attempting to eat. Then, without warning, a wave of agony would surge through his infected leg, and the screaming would begin. But perhaps the most chilling detail recorded by multiple witnesses was Henry's reaction during his lucid moments between pain episodes. He would apologize to no one. He would show no vulnerability, no human weakness, no acknowledgement that his suffering was anything more than a minor inconvenience. Dr. Owen wrote that Henry once, immediately after a screaming episode that lasted 30 minutes, calmly dictated a letter ordering the execution of 3 prisoners in the Tower, as if the previous half-hour of inhuman agony had never occurred. The king's physicians realized they were not treating a medical patient. They were maintaining a dying tyrant's delusion of invincibility while his body betrayed him cell by cell, hour by hour, day by day. Medieval medicine had failed completely. Royal arrogance had created a medical environment where effective treatment was impossible. And a dying king's paranoia had turned his physicians into terrified witnesses to a slow-motion medical catastrophe they were powerless to prevent. Hit subscribe if you believe the truth about power should be exposed. Or stay comfortable with the sanitized version history feeds you. Because what we've revealed so far is nothing compared to the psychological hell that consumed Henry's mind in his final days. As Henry's body surrendered to decay, his mind began its own horrific disintegration. The king who had once commanded absolute loyalty through fear now found himself trapped in a prison of his own making, haunted by the ghosts of every life he had destroyed, terrorized by phantoms that existed only in his fractured consciousness. The night terrors began in earnest during the winter of 1546. Palace guards reported hearing the king's voice echoing through the royal chambers at all hours, engaged in what appeared to be desperate conversations with invisible companions. But these were not the rambling delusions of a fevered mind. They were specific, detailed, and absolutely chilling in their consistency. And, forgive me, the words would pierce the darkness of Whitehall Palace, over and over, sometimes for hours at a stretch. Henry would plead with the ghost of Anne Boleyn, his second wife, the mother of Elizabeth, the woman he had executed on fabricated charges of adultery and treason 11 years earlier. Palace servants, hiding behind tapestries and ducking into alcoves to avoid being seen during these episodes, reported that Henry would sometimes reach out into empty air, as if grasping for someone who wasn't there. Other times, he would cower in his massive bed, pulling covers over his head like a terrified child, begging for mercy from specters only he could see. But Anne Boleyn was not his only nocturnal visitor. Thomas More, the brilliant scholar and former chancellor whom Henry had executed for refusing to acknowledge royal supremacy over the church, appeared regularly in the king's nightmares. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, beheaded for the same principled resistance, stood at the foot of Henry's bed demanding answers the king could not provide. Most disturbing of all were the nights when Henry would scream about the monks. Hundreds of them, he claimed, surrounded his bed with their severed heads tucked under their arms, reciting prayers in Latin that he could no longer understand but that filled him with inexplicable dread. Dr. Wendy, in his private notes, recorded that Henry would sometimes wake from these terrors in such a state of panic that his heart rate became dangerously irregular. The king's pulse would race so fast it was barely measurable, and his breathing would become so rapid and shallow that physicians feared he might die from sheer terror. The daytime brought no relief. Henry's paranoia, always present throughout his reign, had metastasized into something approaching complete madness. Every servant was a potential assassin. Every meal was possibly poisoned. Every loyal courtier was secretly plotting rebellion. Kitchen staff were subjected to elaborate new protocols designed to prevent poisoning. Food had to be tasted by 7 different people before reaching Henry's table. Drinking vessels were examined for residue, sniffed for unusual odors, and sometimes smashed entirely if Henry detected what he believed to be suspicious traces. William Somers, Henry's longtime fool and one of the few people still permitted to speak freely in the royal presence, later testified that the king would sometimes make him taste the same piece of food multiple times, watching his face for signs of distress or illness. When Somers once joked that Henry was being overly cautious, the king flew into such a rage that guards had to restrain him from physically attacking the only man who had dared to be honest with him for decades. But perhaps the most revealing symptom of Henry's psychological collapse was his complete inability to look at his own reflection. Every mirror in the royal apartments had been covered with black cloth on Henry's direct orders. Polished metal surfaces were removed or turned to face the wall. Even water basins were kept deliberately murky to prevent accidental glimpses of his face. Lady Margaret Douglas, Henry's niece and one of the few family members still permitted access to the royal chambers, wrote in her private diary that Henry had become convinced his physical appearance would reveal the true state of his soul to anyone who looked upon him. He believed, she recorded, that his face had become so hideous that even brief exposure to his own image would drive him completely insane. The irony was profound and terrible. Henry had spent decades forcing others to look upon death, watching their executions, studying their final moments, feeding on the terror in their eyes as the axe fell or the rope tightened. Now, he could not bear to witness what those same forces had done to him. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the only religious figure Henry still trusted, made multiple attempts during those final months to encourage the king toward confession and repentance. Each effort was met with violent rejection. Henry would not admit to any wrongdoing, would not acknowledge any sins, would not seek forgiveness for any of the thousands of deaths he had ordered. "I am answerable to God alone," Henry would rage whenever Cranmer broached the subject of spiritual preparation for death. "I have done nothing that requires earthly confession." But his night terrors suggested a very different internal reality, a mind consumed by guilt, haunted by consequences, terrorized by the approaching judgment he refused to acknowledge in daylight. The king who had made himself the supreme head of the English Church, who had claimed divine authority over both earthly and spiritual matters, could not bring himself to admit that he might need divine mercy. His pride, the very quality that had enabled decades of absolute power, had become the final barrier between Henry Tudor and any possibility of peace. In his lucid moments, servants reported, Henry would sometimes stare at the covered mirrors with an expression of such profound loss that even his most hardened attendants felt moved to pity. He knew what he had become. He understood what he had done. But he could not, even in his final extremity, bring himself to seek the forgiveness that might have offered relief from his psychological torment. Subscribe to see more tyrants face justice, or let their stories die with them, exactly what they would have wanted. Because what happened in Henry's final 48 hours reveals the ultimate price that absolute power extracts from those who wield it without conscience. January 26, 1547. The Feast of St. Timothy. Dawn breaks gray and cold over Whitehall Palace, but Henry Tudor will not see another sunrise. The final countdown to divine justice has begun, and every hour brings fresh horrors that would have been unimaginable even to the courtiers who had witnessed 11 years of royal decay. At precisely 6 in the morning, as palace servants prepared what would unknowingly be Henry's final breakfast, the king suffered his first complete loss of consciousness. Dr. Wendy, summoned immediately to the royal chambers, found Henry's massive body limp and unresponsive, his breathing so shallow that mirrors held to his lips barely fogged. For 17 minutes, Dr. Owen timed it exactly. The King of England existed in a state between life and death. His pulse was almost undetectable. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor that physicians recognize as the precursor to death itself. Palace servants, gathered in terrified clusters outside the royal chambers, whispered prayers and prepared themselves for the chaos that would follow a royal death. Then, impossibly, Henry awakened. But what returned to consciousness was no longer entirely human. His first words, recorded by Thomas riotously, were completely incoherent, a jumbled mixture of Latin prayers he had not spoken in 20 years, fragments of marriage vows to wives long dead, and what appeared to be detailed military orders for battles that had never been fought. His eyes, when they opened, focused on nothing that existed in the physical world. These episodes of unconsciousness would repeat 17 times over the next 48 hours, each one lasting longer than the last, each one bringing Henry closer to a final darkness from which there would be no awakening. January 27th brought a new level of medical horror. Henry's body had begun the systematic shutdown process that physicians recognize as irreversible organ failure. His kidneys had ceased functioning entirely, a detail confirmed by the complete absence of urination, despite enormous quantities of liquid being forced down his throat by desperate doctors. His liver, damaged by decades of excessive consumption and months of systemic infection, had swollen to 3 times its normal size. Palace servants reported that Henry's abdomen was so distended it appeared he was carrying a child, a grotesque parody of the pregnancy he had demanded from so many wives, achieved now only through the swelling of his own dying organs. But most disturbing of all was the intensification of his hallucinations. What had been nocturnal terrors now consumed his waking hours. Henry engaged in long, detailed conversations with people who had been dead for years. He issued royal commands to empty air. He cowered from threats that existed only in his fractured mind. Sir Anthony Denny, one of Henry's most trusted gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, recorded the king's side of what appeared to be a lengthy argument with Thomas Wolsey, Henry's former chancellor who had died 16 years earlier. For over an hour, Henry defended his dissolution of the monasteries to a ghost, growing increasingly agitated when his invisible adversary apparently refused to accept his justifications. The final night, January 27th into 28th, brought a crescendo of supernatural terror that reduced hardened courtiers to weeping. Henry's voice echoed through the palace corridors as he engaged in what servants described as a great argument with all his enemies at once. Thomas More was there, demanding to know why Henry had chosen temporal power over eternal salvation. And Boleyn accused him of murdering her for political convenience. The monks of Glastonbury Abbey recited the names of every religious house he had destroyed. Cardinal Fisher questioned his right to claim supremacy over God's church. But the most chilling detail, recorded by multiple witnesses, was that Henry appeared to be losing this final argument. His voice grew weaker, more desperate, more pleading as the hours passed. The king, who had never accepted contradiction from living subjects, was being overwhelmed by the accusations of the dead. By midnight, Henry could no longer speak coherently. Individual words occasionally emerged from his lips, but they formed no meaningful sentences. And, forgive, God, monks, blood. The fragments of a conscience finally awakening, too late to matter. The death rattle began at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. Henry's breathing became labored, irregular, accompanied by the horrible wet sounds that indicate lungs filling with fluid. Dr. Wendy later wrote that the king's final breaths sounded like drowning, fitting, perhaps, for a man who had drowned his kingdom in blood. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned at 1:30 a.m. The prelate who had enabled so many of Henry's religious innovations, who had validated his marriages and annulments, who had watched silently as thousands died for opposing royal will, now faced the impossible task of shepherding a tyrant's soul toward whatever judgment awaited. Henry could no longer speak, but his eyes remained conscious and aware. Cranmer asked if the king sought God's mercy. Henry's response was to squeeze the archbishop's hand, whether in affirmation or desperation, no one could determine. At 2 a.m. precisely, as palace clocks chimed the hour across London, Henry Tudor's grip loosened. His eyes, which had terrorized England for 38 years, closed for the final time. His breathing stopped. His massive heart, enlarged by disease and hatred, beat its last. The smell of death that had surrounded Henry for months now intensified beyond endurance. Within minutes of his final breath, the stench became so overwhelming that everyone except Dr. Wendy was forced to evacuate the royal chambers. The King of England was dead. The tyrant had finally met an enemy he could not execute, a force he could not intimidate, a judgment he could not appeal. Justice, delayed for 38 years, had finally been served. But death was not finished with Henry Tudor. Even in the grave, the tyrant would face one final humiliation that would vindicate every prophecy, fulfill every curse, and demonstrate that divine justice operates beyond the reach of royal privilege. The journey from Whitehall Palace to Windsor Castle for burial should have been a solemn royal procession. Instead, it became a grotesque spectacle that contemporary witnesses described as supernatural retribution made manifest. Henry's body, weighing over 400 pounds and riddled with infection, had been hastily embalmed and sealed in a lead-lined coffin. But the gases generated by his putrefying organs could not be contained by royal craftsmanship. On the evening of February 14, 1547, as the funeral cortege rested overnight at Sion Abbey, the very monastery Henry had destroyed and whose abbot he had executed, the inevitable occurred. The coffin exploded. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally exploded with such force that the lid was blown completely off, and Henry's decomposing remains burst forth like some medieval nightmare made real. The lead lining split open with a sound that witnesses described as thunder from hell itself. Bodily fluids, blood, pus, and liquefied tissue, poured onto the stone floor of the Abbey Church where monks had once prayed for England's salvation. The same floor where Henry's soldiers had smashed altars and burned sacred books now ran with the putrid remains of the king himself. By morning, local dogs had somehow gained access to the church. They were found licking up the royal remains with the same indifference they might show to any roadside carrion. The King of England, who had demanded absolute submission from every living creature in his realm, was being consumed by common mongrels who recognized no distinction between royal flesh and peasant meat. This was not mere coincidence. 29 years earlier, Friar William Peto had stood before Henry in public court and delivered a prophecy that had haunted the king for decades. The dogs shall lick thy blood, as they licked the blood of Ahab. Henry had threatened to execute Peto for these words. Now, in death, the prophecy was fulfilled with perfect, terrible accuracy. The man who had terrorized England through fear of divine judgment had discovered that divine judgment was real, inevitable, and absolutely without mercy for those who wielded power without conscience. The man who had executed 70,000 souls had learned that every death demands an accounting. The king who had destroyed lives for pleasure had found that death plays no favorites and respects no crowns. Henry Tudor died as he had lived, surrounded by the stench of corruption, haunted by the ghosts of his victims, and utterly alone in his final moments of accountability. Subscribe to Throne of Lies if you believe tyrants should be remembered for what they truly were, or let them rest in the peaceful graves they don't deserve. The choice reveals who you really are, because this is what absolute power looks like when the mask finally falls away. This is what happens when kings forget they are mortal. This is justice served cold, complete, and utterly without mercy. And this is only the beginning of the stories we will tell. Welcome to Throne of Lies, where tyrants face the truth they spent their lives trying to escape.